Remember all those classic video games you grew up with and how iconic many of them are? Well, odds are they didn't start out the way you remember them. Any great art goes through multiple drafts, changes, chops, screws, and alterations before the final product. And video game development is no different. Final Fantasy VII.
Now, the most anticipated epic adventure of the year will never come to a theater near you.
Final Fantasy VII is often cited as one of the best, most revolutionary RPGs ever. Of course, the game didn't begin this way and wasn't even intended for the PlayStation at first. The story also took a few twists and turns into what was finally released, but the original concept probably would have still made for a pretty good game. When FF7 was first envisioned in 1994, series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi planned for a 2D Super Nintendo game. He envisioned the game would take place in New York City in 1999 and would be more akin to a detective story than what we actually got. It was meant to follow a character named, and we are not kidding here, Detective Joe. Cloud Eris Sephiroth. Detective Joe.
One of these things is not like the others.
Soon, development on the video game was stalled due to JRPG mega hit Chrono Trigger taking precedent for the company. When development resumed in 1995, the original 2D SNES thing was scrapped, and the designers began to focus on the incoming Nintendo 64. Development costs ballooned, and it became the most expensive project of its kind for the time, costing an estimated $45 million in 1995. As it progressed, it became clear the game wouldn't work on the cartridge-based Nintendo 64, since the game's graphics and cinematics would require the extra storage space allowed by CD-ROMs. Ties were severed with Nintendo, Joe in New York got the boot, and gaming was changed forever. GoldenEye 007. Nintendo 64's GoldenEye 007, even years later, is still widely seen as one of the best first-person shooters ever. And yet, during its development, it was never intended to be that. Instead, like many other games of its era, GoldenEye's life began as a standard 2D side-scrolling platformer for the Super Nintendo. The video game's development came towards the end of the SNES's life cycle, so the game's director, Martin Hollis, proposed to instead utilize the power of the Nintendo 64 console to realize the game's true power.
Load a Rumble Pack and see how it feels when 007 meets N64.
With this switch, the plan for the 2D side-scroller was scrapped for an on-rails shooter using a light gun. This would have been pretty similar to the hit Sega game Virtua Cop, but like the 2D plan, this too was eventually scrapped for the familiar first-person shooter people still play today. Sonic the Hedgehog. Nintendo has Mario, and Sega has Sonic, but while Nintendo's plumber protagonist has basically stayed the same throughout the years, the same cannot be said for Sonic. The Hedgehog we all know and love actually began life as a rabbit who could use his ears to throw objects. This was ultimately scrapped, as the chips available on the Genesis weren't advanced enough to properly animate the ears in action. Other Sonic appearance considerations included a sloppy bulldog, a dude in a crown, a creepy jester, and a chick wearing a cap, until they finally settled on the familiar little blue hedgehog we have all come to love. Some people, too much.
Let's act out my Sonic fan fiction. I'll pick something family-friendly.
Banjo Kazooie. Banjo Kazooie is one of the more popular games for the Nintendo 64, but it started out as something completely different when development began in 1997. The original concept came from a game called Project Dream, which was in development for the Super Nintendo by Rare. The video game starred Edison, a boy armed with a wooden sword who would become entangled with pirates on an adventure. After some work, Rare switched gears and reworked the game for the Nintendo 64. Only then did they realize that Edison wasn't exactly working out.
Initially we had a rabbit for some reason. I really have no idea why we picked a rabbit.
A few incarnations later, the rabbit evolved into the honey bear that became Banjo, and an icon was born. Halo. Follow us as we travel back in time to an ancient era called the late 90s. In July 1999, Steve Jobs announced Bungie's Halo at the annual Macworld Conference and Expo as a game plan for both the Macintosh and PC platforms. The original concept was similar to the hit strategy game Myth, but in a sci-fi setting. By the time the game was displayed at E3 in 2000, however, it was completely different. the game was no longer a real-time strategy game and had evolved into a third-person action game. Still, there was no Master Chief, and players assumed the role of a regular soldier. Bungie was far from realizing its future flagship's potential. Everything changed when Microsoft bought Bungie Studios in 2000. With the purchase of the studios, the video game became an exclusive Xbox title. The game was modified into the first-person shooter it is today, with Master Chief as the main character, improved graphics, and an extensive backstory. And for a brief and shining moment, all was right in the world. Doom. Doom didn't start out as an iconic franchise in the making. Rather, the original concept for Doom was just another licensed game based on the Alien movie franchise. id Software later chose to abandon the license in order to get more creative control over the video game, and thus the legendary Doom was born.
But we basically put out a press release before we even started programming the game, and the press release basically said Doom was going to be the best game on the planet Earth.
If you've ever played the granddaddy of the FPS genre, and let's face it, you have, it's not hard to imagine swapping out those nasty demons for Alien's equally iconic xenomorphs. In retrospect, it's kinda hard to ignore the similarities when you really think about it. Space Marines? Check. Nightmarish creatures? Check. Lots and lots of firepower? What do you think?